Hi, everybody. A full house in the Cinerama Dome. That's so cool.
Like that's never happened for one of your
Right.
films before. Please. So, Raiders of the Lost Ark, one of the best films of all time. On tonight, right afterwards. It's the new DCP version, as you pointed out. Personally, when it came out, '81, I probably saw it about 10 times in the theater. And how many people saw the film multiple times in the theater?
It's a young audience.
I am not young. The film resonates on so many different levels, and it's such an amazing film, and there are so many great stories I've heard about it. You went to Hawaii with George, Star Wars did well, he came up with the idea. First question I have to ask you is, when he came up with the idea, what was, it's about the Republic serials that you talked about those. What was your thought in terms of where can we go with the story? And when you brought it to Lawrence Kasdan to write, what were your thoughts as to direction for him?
Well, there was a lot of story before we brought Larry in. The reason we brought Larry in was I had just read a script he had written called The Continental Divide, and I had Universal purchase the script for me when I had Amble Entertainment, and I got to know Larry a little bit from the script. The movie eventually went to John Belushi, but I brought Larry in to meet George, and then there was a 3-day kind of marathon story session at Jane Bay's house in the Valley. Jane was George's assistant in those days. And we broke the whole story in those 3 days, but George handed me in Hawaii a great deal of this movie. The MacGuffin, the Ark of the Covenant, Indiana Jones' entire character, the fact that he was kind of like a little bit like Humphrey Bogart in The Treasure of Sierra Madre. He was rough around the edges, and he didn't do things in a completely noble and honorable way. He was a little bit of a mercenary in his hunt for antiquities. And, the actual, and the Nazis were involved, and Hitler wanted the Ark. He was looking for the Spear of Destiny, but would settle for the Ark of the Covenant. And so George gave me enough of the concept that in Hawaii that day, literally 24 hours before Star Wars opened, at the first 10 a.m. show, he pitched me the story, and I was just absolutely blown away by it.
When you got the first script back, what was your original, when you read it, what was your original thought? Were there things that you want to change? How did that process happen?
Well, every script's the same way. I mean, very few scripts come complete with a stamp of approval the second, the writer hands it to the director. But I must say, there's only been a couple of movies in my experience that I've directed where the script was so close to being ready to shoot. One of those movies was E.T. the Extraterrestrial that Melissa Matheson had written the story of. Thank you. And that was as close to shooting as anything I've ever worked on before. And probably second to E.T. in terms of a script that was ready for prime time was Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's how close Larry had gotten to the original story.
When you start the process of saying, okay, now we're going to make the film, George Lucas is producing, you're directing, you guys are two of the biggest things in Hollywood at that time, certainly still now. And what's the process to go to the studio and say, we want to make this?
I didn't really get too involved in that. That was handled by George and his attorney and my agent. And all I know is I thought that, there was a good chance nobody would make this movie because it was absolutely unlike anything that was being done in 1981. There was no precedent for anything like this, and most of the studio heads in 1981 had never seen the Republic serials upon which we based most of the fun, cliff-hanging, set pieces. So I wasn't sure this was gonna, and sure enough, the movie was turned down everywhere, partially because we were asking for an unprecedented deal that hadn't been given to anybody but Jimmy Stewart and Alfred Hitchcock, and maybe a few other actors. We were asking basically to draw down profits before the studio broke even. And that had never really happened before to any of my generation. And so everybody in town said no. And the only person that stepped up to the plate was Michael Eisner at Paramount. He went ahead and said, I'll do it. And all of a sudden we had a movie.
You have your budget. How many days did you actually shoot for?
I was scheduled to shoot the film in 87 days, and I came in at 73 days.
And that's because of the storyboard you did.
There's a reason for that. I had made 3 movies before Raiders, and they had all gone stupidly over schedule, all of them. Jaws scheduled for 55 days, won 158 days. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which premiered here, scheduled for about 70 days, went 110 days. And then 1941, my third movie, scheduled for I think 75 days, went 179 days. And I was so ready to be born again in a responsible way. So in a sense, for me, Raiders was my chance to prove myself that I could responsibly direct a movie not only on budget and on schedule, but ahead of budget and ahead of schedule. And I think that's why the film's tight. I really think the movie is tight because I didn't shoot a lot of coverage, because I didn't give myself enough time to do all the angles that I had normally shot, at least on the last 2 movies, Close Encounters and 41. I got angles that you'll never see because 3/4 of the coverage I didn't need, but I went and spent somebody else's money and shot coverage I wound up not needing. And I was convinced, because George Lucas was and remains my best friend, that I was not going to do this to George. I was not going to go be a profligate spender and spend all of Paramount's money and hurt George's reputation. So I decided to make the film with less money and less days. In order to do that, I storyboarded every single sequence. Every shot in this movie somewhere, in some archive, probably my archive, has the storyboard. Even dialogue scenes with Belloc and Indy sitting across from each other at a table, that was all storyboarded. And if I was running behind schedule, I would just go up to the big board and I would take down 3 or 4 pictures, and I'd be back on schedule again. And that's exactly how the whole film was shot.
You told a funny story about trying to sit down with Harrison Ford and go through that storyboard a couple times. Tell that story as well.
Well, what happened? No, Harrison was very used to me in the morning saying, "Okay, Harrison, here's the menu for today's schedule." And I would open up my storyboard book, and I would take Harrison through the entire journey of that day, maybe day 23, what we were going to shoot that day. And Harrison, was really patient with me for the first couple. I think he was grateful that I cast him in the movie, but after a couple of weeks of this, and this is actually one of the documentary film guys shooting during the time we were making the movie, he actually caught Harrison as I'm explaining what the next shot's going to be, going like this, waving me off, getting up and walking out on me and leaving me alone in a folding chair with all my storyboards on my lap. And that was the last time I ever went over any storyboards with Harrison.
How long did it take before you realized he wasn't coming back?
No, we'd get ready to do a setup. Instead of showing him the setup on a piece of paper, I would just tell him, walk through the door, sit in the chair, say your lines, and leave. It was like that.
One of the things that makes the film so amazing is the collaboration between you, George, and of course Harrison. And you would also talk a lot about Harrison and what he brought to the role and how it changed that. So can we talk about your thoughts on that?
Well, Harrison made monumental contributions to the movie. His character was really well written by Larry, and it was there on paper, but he fleshed it out. He brought everything to life. Harrison came up with lines. He would just show up on the set, and he would say, "I'd like to say, when I'm looking at all the bruises on my body, to Karen, it's not the years, sweetheart, it's the mileage." Remember that line? I mean, that was Harrison's line. Harrison came up with one-liners throughout the entire experience. And Harrison also was anxious to put himself in a vulnerable position where he would actually get hurt, not physically backstage, but in the movie it would appear like he was really getting hurt. And Harrison kept wanting to get punished. Give me a cut here, I have to have a cut over here, I want to get the crap beat out of me by this big German mechanic. I mean, Harrison was really he was anti-superhero. And even though the superhero craze had not even begun in 1981, we had all read the comic books, and what Harrison did not want to be was a comic book hero. He wanted to be a guy who was vulnerable to the punishment of being dragged behind a truck and beaten up by a German mechanic under a flying wing. And so he volunteered himself to look really bad as he got worn to a frazzle as the story evolved. And that was something that a lot of actors in those days were just not doing. They were actually fighting against that, pushing back against that. And Harrison encouraged us to do more bad stuff to him.
What were dailies like? I'm assuming that you watched them afterwards. Did you ever have to go back and reshoot or anything?
Well, when I went to Tunisia, there were no dailies because we were in Tunisia. So I shot there for 4 weeks and never saw anything. But I kept remembering a story I had heard about David Lean, that David Lean had shot 100 straight, he shot like 230 days on Lawrence of Arabia. But for 100 of those days, they couldn't get the dailies from England to Jordan. So for 100 days, he just depended on phone calls to the laboratory saying that the film was fine, it was looking good, he had people back in London who he depended on. And that story really gave me comfort that I would get on the phone and get lab reports, and the lab reports were good. And I had an editor back there that told me the compositions were good and the picture looked good. And so for 4 weeks, I didn't see a frame of film. I've never done that before or after. That entire sequence with the Cobra was printed down about 2 stops darker than it eventually became when we timed the movie. We didn't discover the snake in the reflection until we went into the laboratory. And I was looking at the answer print, and I suddenly saw the reflection of the snake, and I didn't understand it. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, the perspex that was up to protect Harrison from a venomous cobra had carried the reflection. I tried printing it down from there, but the more you printed it down, the less you could see. And I thought because the shot wasn't going to last that long on the screen, nobody would ever see it. Everybody saw it. Everybody saw it. And I could have had a darker shot, and you would have never seen the reflection, but I wanted the audience to see into the shadows more.
And I'm assuming it's still in the new DCD.
Yes, you'll see it here too.
Thank you for not screwing with my childhood.
I hope you'll see it here. Unless George got into it, then tell me.
What would that call sound like? Did you expect the reception that it would get when it opened?
No, I didn't. No. You know, when you get, for all of you that have done things and maybe made some films or done anything in the creative arts, you know that the worst thing you can possibly do is expect too much. And I've always been afraid of expecting too much, which means if I receive a little, it's enough, often more than enough. So I've never had high expectations, and because this movie was a white elephant in the sense there was nothing quite like it in theaters. We shot it in 1980, it came out in 1981. I wasn't sure how it was going to be received.
Question.